Record.
Okay.
Recording in progress. All right. So we've come together in order to have a conversation about embodiment. And some intention to possibly share this somewhere. Or if somebody watches this, maybe they would like to know who we are and why we are talking about this.
Yeah. Would you like to go first? Or would you like me to?
I'd like you to go first.
Okay. Well, I'm Nathan Vanderpool. I'm curious about embodiment for a number of reasons. I think there's like personal reasons being that I feel I spent most of my life without any, like kind of just looking at that as things that people called embodiment or did that require embodiment as being some kind of like woo bullshit, something like this. And I didn't really understand that it was my own inability to do something that was making me unable to see what others were doing, and like that there could be some value in that. In fact, I think there's a lot of value in it, having like gone a little bit down that road. I say a little bit because I think that I'm not the most embodied person that I've met. But then the question, like how, so there's this thing of that we're talking about, that we want to talk about. And then my questions are like, to what extent can we like point toward it with words and not take us away from it? And what can we do to practice this thing that's really hard to put into words, that like seems to be in many ways to be pre-verbal? And I'm very curious about your experiences and to sort of try to get some handles on this somehow. I have like various ways of looking that have developed in conversation with other people and my own personal research, but I'm very curious to exchange about it with you. I think that if we hit on something that we can see what we're touching without having to focus on the exact way that we put it or the exact framework that we use. Yeah. Go ahead. Who are you?
I guess I come to it slightly differently. I don't think I had this experience of somebody requesting something from me, or like I was a quite like what would now be called a heady person, or like thought-bound intellectual, even like very dismissive of my own body. Like I remember really in my early 20s just wishing like that I could be uploaded to the internet and not have to deal with having a body. And that just radically changed one day, where I was like alone in my room in a dorm when I was studying at the university, and I had smoked a little bit of weed, and then there was this instant shift from having a body to being a body. And it was just like qualitatively radically different. And what I found was a very weak body. It's like I could feel how my posture was all off. I could feel like somehow the interplay between my low self-esteem and the way my body was held, and like that it wasn't like one was leading to the other, but they were like co-arising and like holding each other in place. Like so it started well, it was part of like a very large investigation at that time, because I tried other drugs also in those years, and it changed a lot of my perceptions of what's really going on with being a human being in the world. But this specifically led me to start exercising and like start like a twofold interconnected process of working with like my posture, building muscles, but also working with my thought patterns, because I could feel how they, like if I just erected my posture, it's not the same as if I'm like erecting self-esteem that leads to like it's different postures. Like one is adding tension to like there's one kind of collapse in the tension, and then I try to undo it with another tension, and that's different than relaxing into self-esteem, which is softening, which looks a little bit similar but is less tense. So that, I mean, that's 20 years ago, and I'm still doing that work. But it bears a lot of fruit progressively.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
And then I recognize, I think there's a lot of, well, I think there's a lot of confusion in the thought sphere around embodiment. And I think it's because I still hold a pretty strong affinity to science and engineering. Like I still value thought. I still think that Western philosophy, with its critique and doubt around the truth of the first person experience, it holds some kind of truth, even though it's also a particular type of delusion. But it's not by rejecting it that we find less delusion. I think it's by moving forward and bringing in something more. Anyways, we'll come to that. I think since then I've also done a lot of circling, which is now one of my preferred approaches to embodiment, and I think we'll come to why. And I'm now trained as a circling leader, and I work as a senior leader at Circling Europe. And I think I was hoping for you to bring in something like that as well, because you're working with a particular teacher and you're connected to the Respond network and like.
Sure, yeah.
One of those things.
Yeah, well, I mean, in this context, over the last couple of years, I was like running the Respond project, was trying to bring together different wisdom teachers.
Just like we came up with a sentence or two about what the Respond.
Oh yeah, what is that? It was just like a project that was born out of me spending time in a monastery and like experimenting with practices and ecologies of practices, so different practices that kind of balance each other out. And I basically like went on a bit of a research project for myself around the concept of wisdom. Like, what is wisdom? It's a word, of course, and so then we can make it mean whatever we want. And yet, like, what are we talking about when we talk about wisdom? And what are the different things people are talking about? Because some of it seems to be like pre-rational superstition. Like we have this book and somebody wrote down the wisdom and now we have the wisdom and here it is. And that seems to be one thing that people talk about. And I wasn't very interested in that. But the other thing people are talking about is more like a process of coming into touch with what's more real and living skillfully and like caring skillfully. And you can just sort of like, when you meet somebody with that gravitas and they seem like they're actually in tune with what's happening here. They're grounded and they make sense and they're not getting involved in all kinds of drama and not, they're kind of like, they seem really solid. There's something, I don't know how to put that, but they seem like there. And what is that? And if that's wisdom, like what is that? And how do we get into that process? And so in the course of that, I brought together, like, tried to find teachers that I found like in the space that they're trustworthy, that I really thought they're saying something important about this, and bring them together to see if there's some way of looking that they looking together would like all see, even in the while their individual teachings have a lot of idiosyncrasies and things that seem to not match. Is there something, they're not necessarily in contradiction, but I was trying to find those places too. Are there actual like just disagreements here, or is there a way of looking at this that we step out and get a synoptic view of like, oh, actually we're talking about this area and you have this approach, and maybe that works for some people and other people this other approach will work better. In any case, we divided, or we sort of like in the course of having these conversations, it came about that we started to talk about the DIME paradigm, where we talk about dialogue, imaginal, mindfulness, and embodiment. And we didn't get so far as to like codify that this is the truth, although there are some definitely that agree with me, and this is the way that I see it. So I'm just representing it as my view rather than like Respawn's view right now. But that embodiment is the base capacity, without which you can't really do the others well. I suppose like you can be in your body as an animal, reacting to the things that are actually happening around you, or responding to them. Like that's possible without the other, without being mindful, so sort of stepping back and looking at it. It's possible without playing with all kinds of different, I mean, perhaps we do these things naturally, but like you could imagine a person who is skillfully living as an animal. But of course, like these other capacities like come online because we are social animals, so we need dialogue, and we need the imaginal because we do exist in time, and we need
well, I mean, I think I understand 3 out of 4 here. Like it means dialogue. I understand this word if you're using it in a normal way. Mindfulness for me is similar to embodiment, but with like a distance to it, or like, or I guess
yeah.
Well, me, it's like the reason we need mindfulness is because as we come into the world, like through infancy, and we are created by culture, or like in dialogue with culture, it seems that many of us lose connection with our direct experience of our body and senses, and we have this layer of thought injected in between. And mindfulness is a particular technique to try to pierce through this wall of thought, to access to direct perception.
Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, I'm saying this thing about like these capacities and this in the base of it, and like maybe that's all this like a weird way to conceive of it because it all comes online in together.
Don't like the question I wanted to ask is like I don't understand what the word imaginal means.
Okay. So if we just take these other ones that you were saying, and I'll just sort of revisit them and then add the imaginal to show what it's doing that's not the other things. The dialogue is like, how do we communicate about what's happening? So that's pretty clear. That is the usual use of the word, and then there's of course all kinds of stuff in there. The mindfulness is how do we step back and look at what's happening? So how do I take this perspectival shift and not be like sort of enmeshed with and looking through, but like look at the way that I'm looking? The embodiment is how do I sense into direct experience? So before there's, it's different. It's like it is kind of enmeshing with the experience, but but not with the story, with the actual like physical experience that I'm having right now. And then with the imaginal, so that's like how do I sense into direct experience, and the imaginal is how do I play with my understanding. So, for example, right now we have this imaginal frame that like we're two friends meeting to talk about embodiment. That's sort of the imaginal frame in which we're meeting, and we could play with that and say like, okay, now actually we are, like we are two men exploring their own relationship to what is it to have a body as a man. And that'll just shift the salience of what's standing out to us. Like, what are we noticing? So in some sense, you could say, like, from the circling background, imaginal is context. And so you can do practices that make the context explicit. That might be almost a mindfulness practice, but it is like working with the imaginal. You can do practices that change the context, and play with it, and try to become more flexible about what is it that's happening right now? What do I understand to be happening right now? And you can even do some of the practices to end up tuning into that, let's say, transrational material, in order to bring it into like your sense making and see, like, maybe feel inspired or like aimed, or to do something of a sort of like what Burbea calls soul making dharma, like sort of encountering the divine and allowing this encounter to change the way that you're making sense of what's happening to you. So anything that plays with the understanding of what's going on right now is what I would put in this like very large category of imagining.
Mm-hmm. Like, I associate it to having watched like that. There's like a movie and a documentary about the movie, which is about like Jim Carrey is playing, and he's playing this comedian. I forgot what his.
Oh, Man on the Moon, Andy Kaufman.
Yeah. It's like this way of like method acting inspired me quite in my circling and in life. Like, as this, how much we're actually free to choose what context we're living in. Like, we can actually, like, most of our personality, we take it as given. I think some of it is, but we can also like pull out the threads and reweave them in other ways. And then that, like, yeah, there's something here about what is authentic, what is not authentic. That's also like a really interesting concept to me, because it seems to me that authenticity for me has something to do with relaxing and allowing me to respond naturally to my circumstances. But those circumstances are a mix of received sensory inputs and unconsciously and consciously applied interpretation. And that is like, that seems to be what you mean by the imaginal, and this is quite malleable. Like,
yeah, and I think the word playing there is like really important. So it's not just, there's a way that one could conceive of like that and say, oh, we can, the claim is that we can just ex nihilo like create a world and a self, and maybe I'm not sure, but I can't. But I do feel like there's a stretchy, malleable, shiftable thing about it. That's not just like I can make something. I could, I can just, now I'm a bird, or whatever. But like I can, yeah. Ich bin auf einen Anruf. It's just a second, sorry. Close my window so people feel it's less appropriate to just interrupt me while I'm talking. Even if I tell them I'm going to call, they continue to think it's not a big deal. Oh yeah, this malleable character. I don't think that it's a. I don't imagine it to be just something like hyper constructivist. We create this thing out of what, and it's whatever we want to create. But I do see it as something that we can bend and play with, and it's not so solid as it often seems. So our understanding, composed of all those things you're saying, I think the imaginal practices allow us to like get a little bit more agency, and the authenticity, to my mind, can come. There's one way we could talk about a flow of authenticity that's coming spontaneously, and there's another way we could talk about that's more almost structural to me, where I'm trying to look at like, what is it? How am I making sense of this, and play with it in a way that like I want. like that follows how I want to do that. Like I do that whether I want to or not. It's not something I can stop doing, or maybe I can if I'm a Zen master, but I've never experienced that either, like complete lights out. And in any case, I can't do that on command. But I am making sense of what's happening to me through these other practices, through like dialogue. I can open up new spaces that I didn't see before with you. That also, like, these flow into the imaginal as well, is what I'm saying. Like, they're not sort of a separate thing. Like through mindfulness, I can step back and look at the thing. Then I can play with it better because I understand what it is a little bit more. And with the embodiment thing, it's like, it's at the root of it. I mean, we've talked about this before, but like there's, for example, there's tension in my body. I'm understanding, or I'm maybe able to step back and look at that. I'm able to play with the understanding that I have of like, why is there tension in my body? So maybe it's actually that I'm hungry, or maybe it's actually like, I'm scared that I don't have any friends, or whatever it is. And I can play with different interpretations, and then we can talk about it. And I can talk about it skillfully with you and try to like sense make there. So all of this is happening to bring me deeper into touch with what's actually going on. If I have these capacities, I'm better able to do that. And so that's, to me, where this embodiment falls as one of the capacities for coming into a deeper relationship with what's actually happening and being sort of grounded and present. And in that way, one could say authentic.
Yeah, I like how you're landing in like what is actually happening, because I think that's like the clearest path for me into this field that we're now talking about. With that experience and some other experiences back in my student days, like I was already on this kind of, I mean, since I was born, basically, like I've been wondering, like, what is the world, like what is true. I'm pretty pretty, if I read the descriptions in the Enneagram, I'm a pretty classic 5 of like, I want to understand things.
Yeah.
That seems to be the main question in life. And and there was like with those drug experiences where I had like, I mean, they do many things, those different drugs, but they really interfere with normal cognitive processes. And through that, it became clear that what I thought was a stable, objective world that I could make sense of was actually very much entangled with my psychology and like my subconscious. And so my question of like what is really going on, just that stayed, but my interest shifted quite a lot from physics to like psychology and religion and like spirituality, like with Buddhism being like the best for me that I found, because they speak very plainly and clearly about these, like all of the religions I think are like examining the same territory, but they have different, they've emerged in different places from different people, so their terminology is quite different. And for me, Buddhism is easiest to understand. It's like, I think it's the most engineering like language.
Yeah, they love lists. Yeah, it's weird. Like I'm kind of like comparing, when you're saying this, I'm comparing my journey into like becoming what I would say more embodied. I guess we can talk about that, but like I had this other kind of collapse. I think it was also on a search for truth. And this other collapse of like kind of failing to find it, and then just giving up on the prospect that I could, and seeing everything as just constructed stories. And then I remember like having friends, for example, a friend of mine who was very into, probably still is, I just don't have my contact with him for a while, really into like yoga and different practices like this. And he would have me do, for example, we would do a yoga pose and then we would stop and he'd be like, no, just feel the difference between your left leg and your right leg. And I, for some reason, like, would first of all like be convinced that there isn't really a difference, and second of all, if there is a difference, it's just that there's like, now I've got some kind of blood flow going to this leg, and now but there's an interpretation that he's trying to get me to put on top of it, that like there's energy. And this I didn't, but I mean, when you start to like actually feel into it, then you're like, well, okay, you could call that energy. It's also blood flow. It's also like whatever. But the experience of it feels like a kind of a buzzy, energetic kind of thing. So what do you want to call that? But like at the time, I was just like, this is stupid, totally dismissing it. And I think it was like an attempt to not like to like, I was so in the habit of shutting down the discomfort that came along with being in my body, that that I just didn't want to pay attention to that at all. So I was like, my psyche was like, no, that's not, don't go that way. That's a terrible road. Let's stay over here where it's kind of numb, and everything seems vaguely off and empty, but like, at least we don't have that. So it's different than like sort of a psychedelic experience that's waking me up to the illusory nature of the thing that I thought was real. It's like I kind of just didn't think any of it was real, and I think it was in a way an attempt to do something like spiritual bypassing, but that I'm starting to call, well, I'm starting to call, like in conversation with others, I came up with this way of naming that. It's like, this is like intellectual bypassing. That instead of going into the, oh, we're all love and everything's one, I'm going into none of this matters or makes any sense or is actually real. It's all epiphenomenological illusion on top of something that's real that I can't touch. So some kind of paradigm like that.
Yeah, like here, like I've also had my struggles with the word energy. Still think it's a bad name for the direct experience of your body, even though it makes sense. Like I also understand why it's used, but using a word, it's just like energy. I see people making the like short circuit between physicists' use of energy and like body worker use of energy, and they have nothing in common. So it's just like a breeding ground for confusion.
Yeah. I think that's right. There is an equivocation that takes place when people use, especially this metaphor, because we're so science heavy in our culture right now, that we then imagine we're materialist fundamentally, and we imagine then that there is this energy like electricity or like any kind of other field, like a magnetic field or something else. And we imagine this as the same thing as that. And I think one is based in a physical reality that actually doesn't require human experience. That's just my take. I don't have a way to prove that or good reason to believe it, but I do look at it that way. And the other one is based entirely in human experience. I think if we didn't exist, this kind of energy wouldn't be felt. I don't know if it would exist or not. It wouldn't be like something about human beings. This energy exists because we exist. I don't know if you believe that.
I mean, the way I see it is that the whole me sitting here looking at a screen, like looking at a computer with a screen with an image of you, the way I hold the truth of what's going on here is that somewhere there is like a complex reality where it makes sense for me to call it these things. But like my first person experience of me sitting here watching a computer. This is like a rendered image within my nervous system. This is like my understanding. And I mean, that was that experience has been created by reading science, of course, but also by taking drugs, which like completely destabilizes this that I thought was the actual external world, and just starts moving and swaying and melting and like pulsating, and just became very clear that that's not the world. It's like my take.
Yeah,
And
I hear that. I hear that.
And what I take energy to be, like, it's not an accurate portrayal of the world either. It has all kinds of heuristics, and like there's a lot of stuff going on in the brain before it's presented as this to me. And even that's a weird way of saying it, because this to me is also a rendering within that thing. Energy, thoughts, emotions, like all this are like parts of the user interface between this organism and the world. And there's no reason to believe that anything of it corresponds to actual things in the world, except by dialogue and measurement, and like to coordinate over between people and over time what things seem to be real. And the only and there, I don't even know that there is a good reason to do that kind of stuff, but what it has led us to is to figure out a lot of like really intricate patterns about reality that has allowed us to build this computer that's in front of me. I mean, other people.
Yeah. Humans, us humans.
Yeah.
I'm on team human. I take credit for, that's a dangerous thing though. If we start to do that, like we also commit genocide.
Yeah.
Well,
But
true. But yeah, I hear you. It kind of brings up in me this thing of like almost like a different take on the simulation hypothesis, which is like somehow there's, even in the simulation hypothesis, a shared reality in which we all exist, like in the Matrix, let's say, as this pop culture reference point. There is that building in which all the human bodies sit and are plugged into the Matrix. But that world is kind of represented, at least, as a world in which a world that we would understand. And there's a way in which, like what you're saying, is kind of like each of us lives in our own simulation of a world that we couldn't possibly understand. So there is maybe a world in which we exist.
I mean, it doesn't even make sense to imagine what understanding is differently than what it is to participate in it like we do. I think, like, what would it be to understand that world? Like,
yeah, it's different. It's very different. I agree with you, and I think there is something there, which is to say, I think the ineffable profundity of the experience that you have on psychedelics or in deep states of meditation is a kind of understanding. It's not an understanding that you can put into words and that you can logically grasp. And so it's different. But we might exist on that plane, all of us, in some kind of way that we can't understand through language and but that we're constantly striving to point through toward through poetry and music and good friendship and like all these other things that we're trying to we're like, oh, but that's beautiful. See, it's that way.
Comes to, for me, what drives me towards this thing we're supposed to be talking about, embodiment.
Yeah.
There's something with coming into contact with this, which I think is accurate also to describe as a type of understanding, like a more accurate understanding of what's actually going on. And it's not so much about it being in more accurate, or although I like accuracy, but there's something with this way of inhabiting the first person experience of being alive, like really feeling yourself, it has a particular value in, like, at least in my experience, when I both looking at other people and looking at my own history, it seems clearly evident to me that inhabiting your senses, like your experience of your body and like the vibrancy of your visual field, and like hearing things without, like, not interfering too much with this kind of what you call intellectual bypassing, really being in it, is a state of deep rejuvenation and a sense of meaningfulness. Like, this is where it makes it worthwhile to be alive. And this other way of being is very gray and depressing and void of meaning. And so in some ways, that other state, the depressive state, the like clinging to science knowledge, it has a lot of value in terms of engineering power. And in some ways, I think we could, in some conceptions of the word true, I think it's more true than this first person lively experience. But, or yeah, in very specific terms of what is true, like the sciencey word true, but the religious, like, lived truth, this other way is more true. This is actually going on. There's no denying that these vibrations that I feel are being felt. Like, there is existence to this experience. And what we need to be careful about is some of the interpretations and no, yeah, I guess just some of the interpretations and conclusions we can draw from it. But it as lived experience is true and meaningful.
I agree with that. And I think there's like there's something of a distinction that I often make in myself when thinking about these two different kinds of truth. Is like, one is a truth that's like almost like this truth that you're speaking of, like a knowledge truth, a science truth. It feels like a kind of steel or concrete. You could just something hard and solid, and like that is true. So if we want to build this computer, we can use all of the information we have about these materials and how they'll fit together and the processes that we can, and like all the different things that we can make this thing happen. And then like, look at the complexity. It's insane that this works. Like, this things that we're talking over in the whole system that it's built to, that's crazy predictability. That it all is built on. There's no chance involved there, or this would all come crashing down all the time. And so there's something about a knowledge of the truth of the way that the physical world is and the way that things are, that's hard and solid. And then there's this other kind of knowing that feels like much more about like I usually use this, the image comes to me like resonance. It's like a kind of like, yes, it's true. It's not yes, that's true, but it's like kind of like a yeah, like that. And I imagine that kind of truth that feels very meaningful to be the same kind of truth that I tune into as a musician when I'm writing a song. And I'm like, this line, not that line. This melody, not that melody. This word choice, not that word choice. Like, why? Like, there's no hard truth that says it goes C, F, A minor instead of C, A minor, F. Like, there's just not. But there's something in me that's like, it's this, and it's not that. And that kind of resonates somehow. It's like, yes, and it's a very different kind of truth, but it's I think it's the kind of truth that you're pointing to when you talk about the meaningfulness and bringing that to embodiment. Here's the question that I'm holding. So I believe that to be true. I look at it that way, and that opens up on the one side, if that's right, that opens up the possibility of living as an artist to everyone. Like whether or not you've developed artistic skill in a specific medium, like you can develop artistic skill in living your life, which is kind of fantastic. But then I have this question sometimes around like, so I imagine an essential quality of being able to do that is embodiment. I even have some inklings of answers to my own question, but I'm going to ask you first because I want to know if I'm right about that, and it's the same quality that I do when I'm tuning into like writing a song. Like some people who are artists are notoriously like not in touch with reality, let's say, or not in touch with some kind of reality, and they're very like wildly, unpredictable, unreliable, seemingly like sort of tortured by their own minds and stuff like this. And so you would almost imagine that like the only way to make really good art would be like to have such an overflow of this embodiment that you could really tune into what's beautiful and make this art. And I think you can. I think that's actually a possible path. But then there are people who like clearly aren't, but they're still making beautiful art, and often with the help of the drugs. So then I'm wondering, like, what is this thing? Like, where is it that this thing that you can train a capacity to hold, or you can take drugs in short circuit and tune into? I don't know if I'm already defining the answer too much, but I'm curious, like, what you think about the idea that people can do amazing things without embodiment that resemble the kinds of amazing things we would want to do with embodiment. Maybe, I don't know, you know what I'm saying? You see what I'm
saying? I don't fully understand the question. Like I thought I understood it, but then you brought in embodiment, and it's unclear to me how that related to the art and the
great. Yeah. So to my mind, the embodiment piece is like the way that I understand the resonance is like, it's not a logical thing, so I can't work it out on paper. I can only tell that something's beautiful because it resonates with my body. Like, or with this sense of like, that. And so it's truth, but in a different kind of way.
I mean, for me, I somehow here I'm associating to some kind of other polarity or axis where I usually, I don't know how well supported I am here. Like if I were to talk to a psychiatrist or something, but I tend to look at almost like a polarity or like a scale where people go from, at the extremes, you have like schizophrenics and autists. And that seems to me to be not particularly correlated with embodiment, but something else.
Yeah.
More like this the dance between contraction, grasping, understanding, and like allowing, trusting, just dancing with whatever comes, or something like this. So like if you're just like whatever happens, you believe it. That's like the schizophrenic kind of. And if you're like, oh, I'm just like holding on to everything, like it's this way or it's that way, or like the autist. Like probably I shouldn't be using diagnosis to.
I think you get where you're pointing at.
Yeah, but it's like
all of us.
closedness and openness, and in my view, they're both dysfunctional, and you need to have like this breathing quality between like gently grasping stuff as you need them and then letting go as you don't need them, and continuously reshaping your grasping tools or like your concepts. And then your embodiment is part of what you can grasp or not grasp, or like it's there as part of everything that is in your experience. And maybe you are dissociated from it, or maybe you're present to it. That's a different thing than I think artists, as you name them, is more towards the schizophrenic side, or like the openness. It's like you're ready to do associations that are maybe not valid, but they are associations. So like you're more concerned with a kind of rhyming truth than like a solid connection. It's like, oh, this is a bit similar to this, and that somehow, when it speaks to our openness, we like those kinds of associations, and it's like a way, in one way, understanding something is the same as this rhyming quality, but it's like to understand something, I think, is the same as like putting it in terms of another situation that you're already familiar with.
It certainly, that happens, and I see that dynamic. I'm kind of like, I think I'm aiming at something that's a bit, because otherwise, like, well, one thing we could say is like, there's a difference between like, okay, let's drop maybe the clinical diagnoses and say there's a difference between someone who's like just like off the charts high in openness and as a personality and a good artist. Like they're not one-to-one. So somebody could be like super associative. I'm making up like, and I'm with like, and I've met these people. They're just constantly telling you a completely different story that they're absolutely convinced of about what's happening right now, based on like whatever just came through my my system. And there's like that, and there's somebody who's like can sort of discern, but that one is one to repeat. That's a song to sing again. Like not just that's an image that actually like has a deeper, it's not just association. Like they're kind of doing a bit of a discernment of like, this thing is actually an expression of something deeper, and that's just an association. So you meet somebody who's just associative and very open and believing everything, whatever. They're not doing the artist thing. And the artist thing to me is like, it's actually something that maybe it's not about embodiment. That might be, I don't know. But it does seem to me that like the quality of the beauty of a song, for example, is nothing logical or hard in that sense. It's a resonant truth. It's resonant beauty, like that comes into me and I'm just like, whoa. And I feel it in my body. I don't think it. Yeah. So there's some kind of connection there to like this, the generative associative thing, being able to trigger something in me that isn't just on this level of putting things together that weren't previously together, but it's like, and this, it speaks something. I don't know.
It seemed to me so here there's like, I want to bring in a different distinction that we haven't talked about, or we haven't named it this way at least. There's like the thought level, which is, or like there is this experience that I'm having, and I'm convinced you're having something of the same quality. Like, and like I said, the way I hold this is that this is like a coming together of a lot of stuff and being rendered as a scene within my nervous system. Yeah, kind of. And so sometimes I see that as like a surface, and there are things below the surface and there are things above the surface. So what I'm consciously aware of is above the surface. And this is like what I would call, here we have cognition. We're with our experience. It's like co-gnosis, which is like an old Greek word meaning a type of knowledge that is connected to sensation. Like they had two words for knowledge, which you also have in German and Swedish, or like English lost it, unfortunately. But you have like the kind of knowledge that is related to ideas, and the kind of knowledge that is related to like bodily familiarity. The idea version is linguistically connected with eyesight and like seeing something. So there's like sort of separation, and you only know it by seeing it. And then gnosis is about having felt it and being like intimate with it. Deeper sense of knowing. And that, I think, is like, I think this cognition is a good word, because it's like there is this gnostic level which is below the surface. That's what has been really integrated and is now just part of the rendered scene. Like when you see a familiar object, just looking at it, you know, like it's not, we think that our vision is colors and we can paint it. But actually, when you look at something, you know what it's going to be like to touch it. That's part of your looking. You know what it's going to be like to lick it even. That's also part of your knowing. There's a lot of knowing already in the objects. That's like the below surface knowledge that comes into like this Gnostic level. And then we have the co-Gnostic level, the cognition, which is thinking and like drawing conclusions. And it's like this linear process and spot-wise attention. But what you're saying, I think, is that as an artist, you learn to listen to what is coming from under the surface. And you're not like restricted to this linear process of drawing conclusions from things that you can linearly figure out, but you're trusting the mechanisms of your organism to deliver, no, this is actually what feels right. And I don't know why. It's mysterious, but the power of our brain is immense. Well, and flawed, but also there is something similar between our brains, such that if your subconscious deems A as better than B, likelihood is that other brains will do the same. And so you can have this artistic process that isn't based on linear thought, but on something different. I think this is, yeah, some kind of connection here to embodiment, because embodiment is also about not doing linear thoughts about your body, but trusting that the sensations that are there are already enough. Move from below the surface.
That brings up for me like this thing that does feel very true, that a lot of the bypassing that I've done myself and that I see in other people of that direct experience, like this sort of the not attending to the immediate sensations of what is it like right now, is like the remedy to that. I mean, we can be blocked by 1,000 things, but the remedy to that is often some kind of trust. Like, oh, it's like I often feel when I'm studying with a teacher named Vivian Dittmar, and we do this practice conscious release, and it's about tuning into the felt sense of what's happening in your body. Like sort of, that's a big part. It's more complicated than that, but like, let's say that. And often the experience when I encounter some kind of like emotional baggage that just feels so overwhelming, that's when I notice I'm absolutely not attending to the feeling in my body. And attending to the feeling in my body often then feels like getting into freezing water. Like where it's just like, oh my God. And the more I resist, it's terrible. But at some point, if I just say like, okay, then it's there and it hurts, but it's not terrible. It's just, that's an intense experience I'm having right now. And then at some point I get out of the water and often in that case feel like way better. And it actually is a sort of, it tracks to both experiences. But there's a resistance to feeling pain that I think is often, and our whole culture at the moment in the modern West, I mean, look at this. I'm like, this would be, you know, I'm living in like a room in a shared flat, but this is like probably one of the most luxurious domiciles that a human has had historically. Like, oh my God, the temperature is controlled. I can like control the light mostly, like as I want to all day long. There are no predators, like no infestations of like disease or molds or other things that will hurt me. Like I'm safe, I'm comfortable, and like everything is built to maximize that. I think with good reason, like we used to be in a state of nature or closer to it where we were under threat all the time. So we've naturally tended to want to make ourselves safe and comfortable. And now we're so safe and comfortable that I don't know if this is true. Like, I don't know if people used to be better at feeling their feelings when they were constantly under threat. Maybe they just didn't have to think about it so much. And now we have more space, bandwidth to think about the existential questions. But I wonder if, like, I do think we don't train ourselves to do hard things. And this is makes it then difficult to do hard things. So that seems pretty clear to me. And one hard thing is feeling pain. So I don't know if you have what your experience is with like why people, because when you're talking about it, it sounds like just really nice. Like, okay, yeah, I can tune into the meaningful, direct experience that I have. It can be fascinating. I can sort of fall in love with my experience and just be like, wow. And it's really, and it seems like such a obviously preferable world to the gray, dull, bleak, like, why am I even putting up with all of this? So like, what is it that you feel like in your experience of people like blocks them from making that move?
Yeah, well, I think it seems clear to me that it is that the general person today carries a lot of unfelt pain. Well, like it's not exactly unfelt, but it's below the surface, so to say. And we're working hard to keep it under the surface. And it shows up as like tensions in the body and like weird choices on how to act and feel. And it's like
go ahead.
starting that process is always hard because I think often we have it's like there's both the pain that wasn't quite felt once upon a time. Like you were in a situation and it was so unbearable that you chose to push it away, or you were interrupted in your processing of it by someone else that couldn't be with your feeling of that discomfort. Like that's also quite common, that parents can't hold discomfort, and so they force their children to not feel discomfort. And that creates a lot of unfelt emotions that leads to like where we are as a culture, I think. And yeah, it's going to be painful to start healing yourself. But
Yeah.
I think less painful than what we it's not even what we think, but like less painful than what we subconsciously assume. Because what was overwhelming to us when we were 6 often isn't quite as overwhelming when we're 26 or like 36 or whatever we are. And it can also be felt like this kind of comes back to like the hook I put in the start of like, I was going to return to why I like circling for this. There is something with the circling space. Circling is like a practice where we come together as a group and then we examine together what it's like in us right now. Whatever that is, if it's physical sensations or emotions or thoughts, and we just have a conversation about it. And what is special about circling often, I think, if you have a certified leader there, is that the leader has gone through some kind of training where they have space to not be so reactive, and they can hold you in ways your parents couldn't, like, or that you yourself struggle with. So like, in order to feel ourselves, it seems like we need some kind of anchoring to remain safe. Like if we feel something that feels so threatening that we don't feel safe anymore, we'll shut it down in order to feel safe, because that's the priority we have. But if there's somebody else who can hold and show you that you're safe while you're feeling it seems like we can feel our way through deeper stuff and back into, yeah, now we're talking about a surface and above and below, so depth, I guess, becomes a good metaphor, but you can feel yourself to a deeper level, and you can start to untense some of the tensions you have that are there in order to distract yourself from particular sensations and emotions and memories. That's how I believe. I think I have very good evidence and reasons to believe this, but it's hard to explore this scientifically. So it's a different type of symbolic space. It becomes a lot about people's experience.
Well, I mean, yeah, I see where I wouldn't know the first thing about like how to relate that to science, although I do imagine that there is increasing stuff toward that. I've heard some stuff, but I'm not the expert on that relationship. But I do hear something that's always kind of interesting to me. Is like we talk about embodiment and we talk about feeling, and then we talk about like I am a body, so how could I not be embodied?
Mm.
And these feelings, you can't actually not feel them. And so there's something about what we're doing that's related to that seems to me to be important, which is like it's not about producing something, and it's not about changing the way that things are on a base level. It's really about like awareness.
Mm.
I mean, this lines up very well with like Vivian's teaching is about like this, why she calls this practice conscious release. She's like, you just need to bring, it's like composting. You need to bring the oxygen of consciousness into the pain. Yeah. And then you'll, like by just being with it, it'll move and process. And then we don't do that, then we get this like stinking, rotting shit that's just down there, like causing all kinds of symptomatic problems. Like we have a fly infestation, but we don't really know why. And it's like, but this, I think, so there's just something important, seems something important in there about like, what is embodiment and what is feeling? If you are a body and you can't actually not feel, it's really, we're talking about an awareness, attentional thing, more than fundamentally like what's happening. I am a body, I feel stuff, and the only thing that can go wrong is like I'm moving my attention away from it because it's painful. I don't want to be with it. I don't want to be aware of it. I want to like try to like exist over here where that doesn't exist, and that's not possible. So it's about like sort of coming more into a wholeness of the experience that I'm having right now.
Mm.
That I think embodiment points to that. Like we can't, if embodiment is something about experiencing direct sensation, like sensing into direct experience, it's about bringing attention to that. Because it's already all happening. And then like, what am I attending to in my experience of right now?
Somehow it is happening, but like it's below the surface and I'm doing stuff to avoid it coming through the surface. And like in this moment, right here, right now, like I notice like I have some tension over my chest. Like I'm not fully relaxed. I'm not fully present in my hands and in my upper chest. And there's a way in which it's just a choice to really feel it. But when I move towards that, it's like a repelling force that is very strong. Like it feels, yeah, it feels like if I were to really feel myself, I might like disintegrate, or like it feels very scary. So it's like a choice that I think potentially I could make, but like actually I can't make it. And I read like my association to this, like in this, like how you understand stuff by moving it into a different situation that gives you some kind of way of talking about it. Like if I do that, my association is to when I'm out at the outdoor gym here, there are like a bunch of wooden things spaced apart, and you can jump between them in different ways. And there's some that are higher and some that are lower. And when I go there and I go to the highest wooden thing, and there's a way in which I can jump down onto like a thin little wooden board. And when I came there the first time, like standing there looking at the little board below, I was like, I can't bring my body to jump down. It's too dangerous.
Yeah.
But when I go down to like a lower one and a closer one, I can make that jump. And once I've made that jump a couple of times, I go up to a little bit higher and I make that jump a couple of times. Then eventually I come up to the highest one and I can make the jump because now I trust that I will survive, or like I won't break my foot, because I've tried it a couple of times at things that are within my reach. And this is all within 1 hour. So I haven't changed physical capacity actually. I've just like lowered, or like I've increased my own trust in my ability to survive or like not do serious damage. And I think it's the same here. Like it's sometimes some of this stuff I can step into it when I'm in a space with somebody that I really trust. And I think that's like for me that one of the things that has been so beneficial for me with circling is that many times there has been a leader that I can trust, or there have just been other people that I could feel trust in that moment. And when I tried the conscious release thing with you, that's also part of why it's a pair practice, right? So you held a loving presence for me and I could trust you, and then I could feel myself in a way that is difficult when I'm not with somebody who is really embodying safety and love for me. So I think there's something here with like how to, like as a circling leader or as an embodiment coach, or like the job is to create enough safety and have the discernment, help people with the discernment of like what is there to be felt and how do you move closer without it feeling life-threatening.
Yeah. And I mean, when we're talking there in this context, I think that's very right. You want to help somebody move there without it feeling life-threatening. And then another question comes up for me, which is like, when you become a little more adept at this kind of thing, like, and you realize, you start to trust, like, oh, I can feel, something really big, something really deep, and I won't die, and it's okay, and I come back out on the other side. It feels like to me, so I'm kind of like in this position where it feels like to me, like some of the things that are the most remaining in my system that bring up these distortions are totally feel life-threatening. Like whether or not I'm actually, and then the question becomes like kind of like, one question for me becomes like, what are the kinds of containers that allow people who are trying to, because I think there's a sense in which like, this is one of the things that Vivian talks about in her coaching with others, like teaching people to be coaches, is like you can't accompany somebody through something that you weren't willing to go through yourself.
Mm.
So like the best way, or a good way, let's say, to get somebody in a facilitation role to be able to be non-reactive is to have gone through all of their own reactivity. Or at least like the more they've done that, the more they'll be able to be with somebody else and whatever they're with. And if the other person is tapping into something that this person who's facilitating themselves can't be within themselves, then it's going to start to spiral out of control. So what we're, how do we get containers that are safe for people who are further along in this and have experienced the sort of like the low waves and the medium waves, and in some ways need to go to like the high wave things, and yet like the container for that, like, what is that? In the past, it might have been like just that we live together in an ashram or something, or in a monastery. But like, what do we do now? If we're not going to go commit ourselves to like sit in the monastery until we've gone through as much of it as we can, like the next 5 years, I'm going to sit in the monastery. And then the question, like when I come out, have I integrated all the things that or am I just like now very suited to being in a monastery? But how do we get to that? How do we get to these deeper things? How do we really wake up outside of it seems like the low waves, you can teach somebody that like, oh, like you think you're drowning, or like, let's just be more specific. It's like, oh, you think you're the only one who feels like an outsider. That's so easy. First of all, you're not an outsider. That's a construction, but like that's a harder sell. But you can definitely say like, can we as a group talk about all the times we felt like an outsider since we've been here together for this last hour and a half? And people start to share, and then suddenly that person's like, oh, I'm not alone. And so there's super easy things to stress like that. But then there's like all the way down at the base of your sense making, of your cognition, things that are like so deep and painful that your whole psyche is constructed to not see that or not feel it, to avoid it. How do we hold each other in that? That's a big burning question for me. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I mean, for me, it's definitely part of the answer is circling trainings. Like what we do in like Circling Europe has these 6-month trainings, and a lot of what is being done there is as like a safe container to go through all of your reactivity, so that at the end of it, you're able to hold others in them feeling themselves. Like initially, it's hard because every time they do something, like stuff is triggered in you, and then you get the chance to be with that, and you're like circled on it, and eventually you've gone through the top layers, and you're more able to be present with people. And then now we're having deeper trainings, which are called surrender leadership trainings. That goes into even deeper territory. But like, yeah, you've met Soryu for All, Buddhist teacher in America that I've also spent time with. And he has this criticism against circling, that it's intimacy without friendship. And I think that's one of the strongest critiques of circling, but I think it's also a misunderstanding from his side of what circling is. I think that is what circling is in a way. It's like a container where you can go and you can explore particular ways of relating and deal with your stuff without you first having to establish like decades of trust. Like I think it's both a strength and a weakness. So the other side of it, like how do we really go to the depths, I think is part of what you and me are doing, is like establishing trusting relationships over time. And it's hard for you and me because we live far apart, and we have some kind of regularity to to our relating, but it's often mediated with a screen. And I mean, eventually, I think it's like building trusting relationships is with competent people who you want to trust. And it like some part of trust, I think some part of trust is impossible without enough time and like without having had experiences that really tests the trust. Like you have to be in situations where you need to trust the other person and they turn out to be trustworthy. I think without those experiences, you don't have real trust. You have imagined trust. Can feel like trust, but it's not. And so you're not going to put yourself in mortal danger without. And I mean, feeling what it's like in my chest isn't putting myself in mortal danger, but I can't make that distinction actually.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like.
And I'm brought to this like, there's like what you're describing is like this interpersonal trust. And it is like, I think it's right that like, I mean, some people can, but only to their own detriment, like completely trust somebody that they have no reason to trust. I suppose it's a risky game to trust people fully. You don't know. Even to trust people that you do know is kind of risky. And there's another kind of trust that Vivian talks about, which I think is like relevant here, which is like a kind of a trust as a skill or state of being. Like, and it's like an existential trust. Like, not that I trust that you're going to do what you say you do, or you're going to like show up for me when I need you, but a kind of trust that like there's a reason that life is playing out this way. Like that it's not meaningless. Like trusting in meaning, something like that almost. Like I'm not sure that I'm representing her view well, so I'll just take it back into mine. I just wanted to reference it and come up with this. But like trusting that there's a reason that this is happening. So like, for example, I can trust you and that will help me tune into this, like the pains that for me, it's like often in my lower belly, like this sort of tension, which just like, and I can learn to try to trust that there's a reason that I have, that this experience is happening. And that's both of those are things that can build, and they're not just choices. Like it's not just out of nothing. As you're saying, like the one is like we're trusting each other and we're getting to know each other and we're seeing each other in difficult situations and we're showing up for each other in ways that matter. Like I came to visit you. If you hadn't been home, I would have been very, very, very far away from where I was supposed to be. Wouldn't know where to go. So there's that, like this kind of trust. And then there's the trust of like you jumping off of the increasingly higher beam and like getting this like, I can do this. I can do this. And I think that this second one, the beam is more like this second kind of trust. It's like sort of this capacity. You build up the capacity to trust like, well, whatever's happening right now, at some point it will make sense to me. So I can go through it right now, even if it seems absurd and pointless. I can go through this, and then as I come back out of that pain, I'll probably look at that pain and be like, oh, that was actually important. It showed me this and this and this, which from a certain point of view seems like, can seem like you're just putting a good face on it, like trying to make it sound nice, like, oh, everything always makes sense. And it's like, no, actually, like think about the things that happened to you in your life, and the painful things that you were actually able to be with are meaningful. And the way that they're meaningful is that there's like some kind of value that was there and having that experience, even if it's unclear to you while it's happening. So you can develop this kind of trust that like these painful experiences that I'm having are valuable on some level, and so I don't need to resist them. And I suppose this is the way to, like from a Buddhist perspective, this is the way to escape suffering. I'm struggling with that personally myself right now. Like, is that really true? But there's something in it, and I'm just bringing it up because I think it's like,
yeah, I mean,
trusting each other, and there's trusting a bigger, trusting life or something.
uh, writing down some like, because you're touching on the other distinctions I would like to make, but I think I think we've talked for like 90 minutes.
That's true.
And I think we should start rounding this off rather than open up new things. And maybe by writing them down, I hope that we can talk about them in a different call.
Yeah, definitely. I'm very good at opening up new boxes, and also therefore very open to closing them, because I otherwise will just keep on opening the box. But yeah, this seems like there's something interesting at the base there for us to build on. We have some things covered there, and some interesting prospects.
Should we try to do some kind of like recapitulate what we've been touching, like what seems to be the most important in what we talked about during these 90 minutes?
Sure.
To me, like where we ended up, it's something about like there is something to the human experience where a lot of our experience is hidden from us. Trust, we can build trust by experimenting and playing with how to live life, and trust somehow helps us to actually feel, because like it's somehow it seems to me that not trusting is where we go into trying to figure stuff out so that we know we're safe. And that's like that's almost like the structure of intellectual what do you call it, bypass.
Yeah.
It's like I will figure everything out before I do it so that I'm safe. But to actually be more experimental and playful in doing things, we build our experiences not as abstract symbols, but as lived experience, as structures in the depth that inform our movements without having to like think things through. And it makes us more skillful, and it makes life more pleasant. It's like that. Is that like I think that's where I'm with what we've been talking about.
Yeah. And like that there's nothing to do to make all of that information appear or become. It's just the unblocking of that experience from my conscious awareness. Like instead of turning away, if I can learn to turn toward and embrace the wholeness of all of it, I don't have to generate anything. I don't have to do anything. I just have to stop pushing away or stop turning away. It's something, I don't know exactly the right language for that, but that seems another important thing, that it's not like there's something that it can seem like you're doing when you're doing embodiment practices, which is developing a body almost. Like it would be if you were like, but then when you say that, you're like, oh yeah, actually you already have a body. I don't need to develop a body. Already am a body. So there's that other piece though about this, like the centrality of awareness in this whole process, as like seeming to me to be something that is also there.
Yeah, this I want to unpack more next time. Seems really important.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anything else that was like really salient to me. Something about, I mean, this isn't like outside of what you were saying, but it's there as another sort of like opening that concept, which is like the rigidity and the figuring it out related to the sort of like playfulness and openness. There's a kind of like, it's almost like the image that came to me was like, it's like the flowers that like suck back in when you touch them. You know this, like
or like an anemone is the same.
what's that?
Like a sea anemone.
Oh yeah. And so it's like, this is a protection move. And it resonates with me very much with like, whatever that pain is, we're protecting back into this little like encasement that we have. It could be intellectual bypassing, it could be spiritual bypassing, it could be like all kinds of ways of not being with the pain, and so not being with everything, but just trying to only be with the not that. That we do this move to protect ourselves, and as we feel safe and we trust and we can like open up to it and realize like I'm not in danger, this kind of thing, then we actually get to be with more of the fullness of the experience. And as you do that, you actually experience more meaningful, more deep way of being alive and relating to your life. That seems to be like the image to me. It's like this shrinking in response to like perceived danger. And so we can either like tune into, one thing we could try to do is tune into where are we actually in danger? Another thing we could do is like recognize that process of opening up takes time. I mean, you could also do it with psychedelics, as you found out. But opening yourself to like not go into your habitual protection isn't something that's just going to happen because it's like, it could, but unlikely to be something that just happens suddenly. Because even you were talking about, that was maybe the other thing that was really important that stood out to me was like, there is a choice that I can't choose. Like it could be seen as a choice, but I don't think I don't actually, it's not actually a choice to just be with all of my pain. It's a process of like opening and learning to trust and like, that takes time. So, and that time might be an important factor for reasons that are not totally clear to me right now. So that's another thing I'm curious.
Yeah, hearing you like makes me want to talk more about the kind of like the promises and the, was that dangers or dead ends of psychedelics?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk about that.
So what I have, yeah, what I would like to talk about next time, I think, is like, well, some of these I'm gonna need to spend some time with to understand why I wrote some things down. But some of it is like, there's something with like the scientific worldview that I'm curious about. Like you talked about crazy predictability, and like there's something with the abstracted, there's something with abstraction. Like abstraction is an interesting thing to talk about. I would like to talk about that. And there's something with like the twofold thing of like analysis and trust, or something there that I would like to unpack. And there's psychedelics. Maybe, yeah, something about, you said initially that this is hard to talk about, and yet we talked a lot about it. And and I'm curious about how much sense it makes for people who listen. Something about words that are like the way we learn words, hear them in the context of shared experience. Like we're in a kitchen and I hold a cup and I call it a cup, and now you know what I mean. Like language is easy when we have things that are represented in the visual world or the auditory world, where we can point or like make our attention on the same thing shared. Comes to like what we called energy.
Yeah.
Or like,
we can get into that.
like inner experiences is really hard to really point to. So we have to use poetic language to try to describe what it's like in terms of things we can look at or hear. And then if it resonates, we're like, oh yeah, now we're fairly confident that we're talking about the same thing, but it takes more time and is less sure that we are actually talking about it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's set up a time to talk again and jump back into it.
Yeah.
I really have to pee, so I'm gonna go do that. But we can let's text. I got another call. I'm supposed to do this conscious release somebody like 8 minutes ago, which I postponed for a little bit. But
All right.
let's jump on. Let's text and find another time, and we can check in again.
Thanks for today.
Yeah, man. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah.
Bye bye.